My net worth sits just north of $40 million. I built it from a single condemned duplex in the Rainier Valley that every bank in Seattle told me wasn't worth the paperwork. I've outmaneuvered city councils, stared down zoning attorneys who charged more per hour than I used to make in a month, and sat across from developers twice my size who tried to absorb my company over a friendly lunch. I've survived 2 recessions and 1 partnership that tried to kill me professionally. None of it, not one moment of it, prepared me for what I walked into at the Sterling Club on a Tuesday evening in October. At the head of the table in the chair that had been mine for 22 years of marriage sat Donovan, and beside him, her hand resting on his arm like he'd always been there, sat my wife Lydia. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for anything. I stood in that doorway for exactly 10 seconds. Then I set down the gift, said what needed to be said, and walked back to my town car. That night, Lydia called me 43 times. I watched the screen light up in the dark and didn't touch it once. The Sterling Club sits on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Elliott Bay, the kind of place where the maitre d' knows your preferred table, and the sommelier remembers you don't like oaked Chardonnay. I'd reserved the private dining room 6 weeks in advance. The deposit alone would have covered most people's monthly mortgage. The floral arrangement, white ranunculus, Lydia's preference, was sourced from a specialty importer in the Netherlands. The tasting menu had been curated by the chef personally after a call with Lydia's sister, Beatrice. Every detail of that room existed because of a check I had written. I was 31 minutes late, not because the evening didn't matter. I had spent the last 4 hours in a conference room on the waterfront closing a $47 million acquisition of a mixed-use parcel that 3 competing firms had been circling for the better part of a year. My general counsel and I had been trading red lines with the seller's attorneys since 2 in the afternoon. When the final signature landed, I loosened my tie, told my driver to take me straight to the club, and thought about how Lydia used to squeeze my hand under the table at dinners like this one, back when she still thought showing up was the same thing as caring. I remember thinking, on the elevator ride up, that she was going to love the bracelet. The hostess led me down the corridor. The private room at the Sterling Club has a set of heavy frosted glass doors with brushed brass handles. Before I reached them, I could hear the room, glasses, low conversation, Beatrice's laugh cutting through the rest like something sharp wrapped in silk. The doors opened and the sound stopped. Not the way sound stops when someone important walks in, the way it stops when a room knows something you don't yet. The table was long, dressed in charcoal linen with a low amber centerpiece that threw warm light across 12 faces, all of whom were now angled toward me with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting. At the far end, directly opposite the door, in the chair positioned at the head of the table, the chair I had been sitting in at every formal dinner of my married adult life, was Donovan. 35 years old, wore a linen shirt open at the collar in a room full of people in formal dress, sandy-haired, loose-smiled, the kind of man whose entire brand is performing ease. He taught something called somatic alignment at a wellness studio in Capitol Hill. Lydia had started attending his sessions 8 months ago. I had written the check for the annual membership myself. He was sitting in my chair. Lydia was to his left. Her hand was not in her lap. It was resting on the tablecloth, close enough to his forearm that the gap was a choice. Beatrice sat 3 seats down. She looked at me the way people look at a situation they've been privately enjoying for longer than they'll ever admit. No one spoke. I walked in slowly. The room tracked me. I set the velvet box, a vintage diamond tennis bracelet I'd sourced through an estate auction, the kind of piece Lydia used to stop and admire in the windows on 5th Avenue, on the nearest side table, not on the main table, on the side table, as if placing it somewhere it wouldn't need to be acknowledged. I looked at Lydia. Her expression was not the expression of a woman who had been caught. It was the expression of a woman who had rehearsed. "Happy birthday," I said. 50 looks like it suits you. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked briefly at Donovan, then back to me, as if checking that the geometry of the room still made sense to her. Donovan cleared his throat and offered a small, composed nod. "Hey, man," the kind of greeting that's engineered to sound unbothered. I looked at him for exactly the length of time it takes to appraise a property you've already decided not to buy. Then I turned, walked back through the frosted glass doors, and let them close behind me with a sound that barely registered. Just the soft, final click of a deal that was already done on my end 4 months ago. If you've ever built something from nothing and had someone treat it like it was always theirs, you already understand what that room felt like. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I want to know who's in this with me. And if you're on the fence about subscribing, stay until the end of this video. That's when everything Donovan thought he'd gotten away with ends up in a folder on a mahogany table. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Because here's what Lydia didn't know when she arranged that seating chart. She didn't know the call I'd made 4 months earlier when a $15,000 wire transfer to something called a mindfulness immersion retreat showed up in our joint account without a conversation. She didn't know about the forensic accountant I had retained the following Monday. She didn't know about a leaner. And she definitely didn't know about the building. Betrayal is just a bad investment maturing, and I had been quietly reading the prospectus for 16 weeks. I review every financial statement that touches my name, not because I'm paranoid, because I built a $40 million portfolio by treating every number as a living thing, something that either grows in the right direction or signals that something beneath the surface is wrong. You develop instincts for anomalies the way a structural engineer develops instincts for a building that's settling unevenly. The floor looks fine. The walls look fine. But something in the way the door doesn't quite close anymore tells you the foundation has moved. That's how it started, not with perfume on a collar, not with a changed phone password, with a line item. It was a Wednesday in late June. I was doing my standard end-of-month review of the joint household account, something I do personally, not because I don't trust my bookkeeper, but because I've learned that the details you delegate are the details that eventually surprise you. Most months the account is predictable. Lydia's stylist, the household staff, the charity membership she maintained for appearances at the right luncheons, the quarterly donation to the Arts Foundation her mother helped establish. Clean, consistent, categorized. Then I reached a $15,000 outgoing wire transfer dated the 14th. The memo field read, Pacific Meridian Wellness Retreat, full immersive program, private accommodation. I sat with that for a moment. Lydia had not mentioned a retreat. We'd had dinner 3 nights before the transfer date. She talked about a renovation idea for the guest house, complained about Beatrice's latest drama, asked whether I was going to make it to her friend Constance's gallery opening. Normal conversation. No mention of a $15,000 retreat. No mention of travel plans. No mention of anything requiring 5 figures wired to a vendor I'd never seen on any previous statement. Lydia thought I wasn't paying attention. She forgot I audit everything. I didn't call her. I didn't walk into the next room and ask. I opened a new browser window and searched Pacific Meridian Wellness Retreat. The website was clean, minimalist, the kind of design that charges you for the negative space. Testimonials from people describing somatic breakthroughs and realignment of embodied truth. A lead facilitator listed by first name only, Donovan. A contact email that routed to a general inquiry form. No physical address beyond Pacific Northwest, by invitation only. No LLC registration I could locate in Washington State. No business license in the public database. No tax ID visible anywhere on the site. I closed the laptop and went to bed. I didn't sleep particularly well, but I didn't make a scene either. When you build buildings, you know when the foundation shifts. You don't tear the structure down until you know exactly where the damage is. The numbers never lie. but they rarely tell the whole story on their own. By Friday, I had retained a private investigative firm, not a solo operator. A firm, 7 investigators, former federal backgrounds, the kind of organization that corporate counsel keeps on retainer for due diligence on acquisition targets. I'd used them twice before. Once on a business partner who turned out to be running parallel financials, and once on a contractor who was billing labor hours against 3 separate clients for the same crew. Both situations were resolved cleanly, because I had documentation before I had a confrontation. I didn't confront Lydia, I investigated her. The lead investigator, a compact, methodical man named Aldridge who communicated exclusively through encrypted files, had a preliminary profile on Donovan within 72 hours. His full name was Donovan Marsh, 35 years old, originally from Scottsdale, 2 years of undergraduate coursework, no degree, a series of short-lived wellness ventures in 3 different states, each dissolved quietly. A studio lease in Capitol Hill under a business entity called Meridian Somatic Arts LLC, registered 8 months prior, the same month Lydia had purchased her first membership. What Aldridge flagged first was the financial picture. Donovan's studio lease was 3 months behind. He carried 2 personal loans from private lenders, not banks, private, totaling a little over $190,000. $1 of the lenders had already sent a formal demand letter. His personal account activity suggested income far below what his pricing structure should have produced, which meant either his client base was thinner than his social media implied, or the revenue was going somewhere before it landed. Loyalty is a choice. Insolvency is a consequence. In Donovan's case, the insolvency came first, and Lydia had walked directly into the path of a man who needed a solution more than he needed a spiritual practice. Over the following 6 weeks, Aldridge built the file, surveillance photos, communication records obtained through legal channels, a pattern of financial transfers from Lydia's personal discretionary account, an account I funded moving to Donovan's business entity in amounts ranging from $4,000 to $22,000. $6 transfers in total over 11 weeks. $81,000 by the time I sat down with Aldridge in my office on a Thursday afternoon in August and reviewed the complete package. He laid the photos out on my desk with the same professional detachment you'd use presenting a market analysis. There was nothing salacious about the way he delivered it, just evidence, sequenced and dated. I looked at the photos for approximately 30 seconds. Then I turned the folder over face down and asked Aldridge 2 questions. First, was the documentation court admissible? He said yes, provided we maintained proper chain of custody, which they had. Second, was there more to find on Donovan's financial exposure, specifically the private lenders? Aldridge said he could go deeper. I told him to go deeper. I didn't call Lydia that night. I made dinner reservations at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try, sat across from her for 2 hours, listened to her talk about a friend's upcoming trip to Portugal, split a bottle of Burgundy she selected, and drove home. She was relaxed, comfortable, entirely unaware that she had been sitting across from a man who had just spent 4 months reading every page of a story she thought she was the only author of. Tears work in arguments, they don't work in audits. September brought 2 important developments. The first came from Aldridge, who had located the private lender pursuing Donovan most aggressively, a Portland-based holding company with a history of predatory short-term lending and a reputation for escalating collections. Donovan was not simply behind on a loan. He was in a position where the lender had begun the process of pursuing personal asset recovery. His studio equipment, his vehicle, potentially his lease assignment rights, if the lender's attorneys got creative. A man that financially cornered doesn't slow down. He accelerates. He finds the nearest available resource and extracts from it as efficiently as possible. Lydia believed she had found someone who finally saw her. What she had actually found was someone who finally needed her. And those two things, to a woman who had spent years feeling invisible inside a marriage, can feel identical until they don't. The second development in September came from a leaner. I had worked with a leaner Voss for 6 years on corporate matters, acquisitions, contract disputes, a particularly complicated eminent domain situation in 2019 that she resolved in my favor when every other attorney I consulted told me to settle. She was the kind of lawyer who read the room the way I read balance sheets, with the understanding that what's visible on the surface is never the whole picture. When I called her and told her I needed to discuss restructuring my personal trusts and separating certain corporate holdings from marital assets, she was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "How long do you have before this becomes active?" I told her I controlled the timeline. She said, "Good, then let's be precise." We met the following Tuesday. I brought Aldridge's file. Alina read it without expression, made 17 handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad, and outlined a restructuring strategy that would take approximately 8 to 10 weeks to execute fully and cleanly, without triggering any legal flags, without alerting Lydia, and without leaving any surface for a contested divorce claim to gain traction. She also said one other thing before I left her office that afternoon. She said, "Desmond, whoever she's with, he's not the problem. He's a symptom. The problem is structural. We fix the structure." I thought about that on the drive home. She wasn't wrong. For the next 8 weeks, I was two people simultaneously. In the evenings, I was a husband in the final chapter of a marriage, present enough to avoid suspicion, absent enough that nothing I did could later be characterized as deceptive conduct. In the mornings, I was executing one of the most methodical asset restructuring operations of my career. Trusts reassigned, corporate entities reorganized. A particular piece of commercial real estate in Capitol Hill, a mixed-use building on a block I had been eyeing for 18 months, quietly acquired through a holding company, Alina, established for exactly that purpose. Aldridge had confirmed by mid-September that Donovan's studio occupied Unit 4B of that building on a month-to-month lease. I signed the purchase agreement on a Monday. By Thursday, I was Donovan's landlord. He called himself a guru. I called him a tenant. I want to pause here because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, why not just leave? Why the architecture? Why the 8 weeks of precision when a conversation and a divorce filing would have accomplished the same result? Here's the answer. Lydia had spent 22 years inside a financial life I built. She knew how it worked, what it was worth, and through Beatrice, who had her own attorneys on speed dial for exactly this kind of situation, how to extract the maximum possible amount from it in a dissolution. If I had walked in that June evening and said what I knew, the clock would have started on her terms. Her lawyers would have been retained before mine had finished reading the file. Every asset I'd worked to protect would have been exposed at the moment of maximum emotional volatility, which is the worst possible moment to negotiate anything. I didn't get mad, I got documented. By the time I walked into the Sterling Club on that Tuesday evening in October, 4 months of preparation sat in encrypted folders, in filed legal instruments, and in the deed to a commercial building in Capitol Hill. The birthday dinner wasn't the beginning of the end. It was simply the evening I chose to let the door close. Lydia thought she was making a statement that night. She didn't realize she had just handed me the cleanest possible justification to execute everything I'd already built. But here's what she and Beatrice did next that I genuinely did not anticipate. They decided, in the 48 hours following that dinner, to take the story public. Social media, mutual friends, a narrative carefully constructed to paint a portrait of a cold, absent, emotionally unavailable husband who had driven a devoted wife into the arms of someone who actually saw her. They wanted a public war. They had no idea what I'd already prepared for a private one. Alina's office is on the 31st floor of a building I almost bought in 2018. I didn't. Because the mechanical systems were aging and the seller wouldn't adjust the price to reflect the capital expenditure required. I've walked past it on certain mornings and felt nothing about that decision. Real estate is like that. You learn early that attachment to a deal you passed on is just nostalgia wearing a business suit, and nostalgia has never closed anything. I mention this because walking into her office the Tuesday after the birthday dinner, I needed to remember how to think like that. Clean, forward-facing, unencumbered by the weight of what had already happened. Alina was at her desk when her assistant showed me in. She didn't stand. She gestured to the chair across from her the way someone gestures to a seat they've already decided is yours and said, "How was the drive?" "Fine," I said. "Good." She closed the document she'd been reading, set her pen parallel to the legal pad in front of her, and looked at me directly. "Then let's not waste the parking." That's Alina. No performance of sympathy. No preliminary softness designed to make the difficult part easier. Alina didn't offer sympathy, she offered strategy. In 22 years of marriage, I had occasionally mistaken efficiency for coldness. Sitting across from her that morning, I understood for the first time that there was a version of respect that looked exactly like getting straight to the point. I opened my briefcase and placed Aldridge's updated file on the desk between us. She didn't reach for it immediately. "Tell me where we are," she said, "in your words." Here is where we were. The restructuring Alina had begun in September was approximately 70% complete. The remaining 30% required careful sequencing, not because anything we were doing was legally aggressive, but because the order of execution mattered. Move too fast on the trust reassignment before the corporate separation was finalized, and you created a window where a contested claim could argue the transfers were retaliatory. Move too slow, and you risked Lydia's attorneys filing a preemptive freeze on marital assets before our restructuring was airtight. Timing in law, Alina once told me, is the same as timing in demolition. The sequence isn't arbitrary. Every charge is placed in a specific order so the structure collapses inward rather than outward. You don't want debris on the street. You want a clean footprint. I wasn't planning a divorce. I was planning a controlled demolition. The first item on Alina's legal pad that morning was the finalization of my revocable living trust restructuring. 3 years prior, Lydia had been named co-trustee on 2 of my primary holding trusts, a decision that made reasonable sense at the time and catastrophic sense now. Alina had already drafted the amended trust instruments removing her co-trustee designation, replacing it with a corporate trustee arrangement through a fiduciary firm she used regularly. The fiduciary was already briefed. The paperwork required my signature and a 14-day processing window. I signed where she indicated. The second item was the operating agreement amendment for my primary development LLC. Lydia had never held an ownership interest in the company itself. We'd been careful about that from the beginning, but her name appeared on 2 legacy documents as a designated emergency contact with limited signatory authority, a vestigial formality from the early years when the company was small enough that such arrangements were common. Alina had drafted clean amendments removing that designation and replacing it with my CFO. Standard, defensible, invisible to anyone not reading the fine print. I signed those as well. The third item Alina placed in front of me was a document I hadn't seen before. A new entity filing. A Washington State LLC, capitalized at a nominal amount, with a name that bore no relationship to any of my existing companies or my personal name. The registered agent was a firm Alina used for exactly these purposes, a legitimate service, nothing unusual, the kind of arrangement large real estate portfolios use routinely to compartmentalize liability. "This is the entity that currently holds the Capitol Hill building," Alina said. I nodded. Donovan Marsh's lease is month to month. His current landlord, who was until 60 days ago an elderly private owner who had held that building for 30 years and simply wanted out, transferred the lease obligations along with the property. She paused. He has no legal mechanism to object to the ownership change. He signed a standard commercial lease with a standard assignment clause. He's just a tenant. She said the word tenant the way a surgeon says incision. Clinical, precise, completely without drama. He sold her mindfulness. He bought himself a posh with someone else's money, and now he was paying rent indirectly through the lease to the man whose wife he'd been sitting next to at a formal dinner 8 days prior. I found a certain architectural satisfaction in that. We moved through the remainder of the restructuring items methodically. Alina had a way of working through complex legal territory without losing the thread. She never circled back, never repeated a point she'd already made, never asked whether you were following along. She assumed you were keeping up and adjusted only if you signaled otherwise. I appreciated that more than I was prepared to say out loud. By the time we reached the prenuptial agreement review, it was nearly 11 in the morning. Alina had pulled the original document, executed 22 years ago, drafted by a different attorney at a time when my net worth was a fraction of its current figure, and prepared a detailed annotation of every clause that remained operative and every clause that required contextual interpretation. Love is blind, but prenuptial clauses have 20/20 vision. The agreement was solid on the foundational question of separate versus marital property. My pre-existing assets and any business entities derived from them were clearly designated as separate property. The areas of complexity, as Alina outlined them, were 3. First, certain appreciation in value that had occurred during the marriage on assets Lydia could argue benefited from her indirect contributions. Specifically, her social network, which had generated 2 significant introductions to investors in the early years. Second, a joint account we had maintained throughout the marriage that had been used intermittently for business expenses, blurring the line between marital and operating funds on a handful of transactions. Third, the family home, purchased 4 years into the marriage with commingled funds, which sat in a category that would require clean documentation to protect. None of these are fatal, Alina said. All of them require us to be precise. She used that word often, precise. I had come to understand that for Alina, precision wasn't pedantry, it was armor. She recommended we retain a forensic accountant, separate from Aldridge, whose work was investigative rather than financial, to produce a clean valuation trail on the business appreciation question. She had someone in mind. She would make the introduction. On the joint account issue, she had already pulled 3 years of statements and flagged the relevant transactions. Her associate would prepare a memo characterizing each one. The business-related transactions could be reframed through proper documentation. The personal ones were small enough to be largely inconsequential. On the family home, Alina was direct. "You won't keep it," she said. "Not without a fight that costs more than the asset is worth. My recommendation is to let it go cleanly as part of the settlement and concentrate your protection on the portfolio." I had lived in that house for 17 years. I thought about that for approximately 4 seconds. "Agreed," I said. Alina made a note. "What I want you to understand about that morning is that none of it felt like grief. I have sat with grief before, real grief, the kind that has weight and texture and doesn't resolve cleanly on any schedule. What I felt in Alina's office was not that. It was closer to the feeling I get during a complex acquisition when the deal finally clarifies, when the fog of negotiation burns off, and you can see the actual shape of the transaction underneath. What you're left with is not emotion. It's clarity, and clarity, in my experience, is the most functional state a person can occupy. The marriage had been a structure. The structure had developed irreparable faults. My job now was to ensure the demolition was controlled, that the collapse served my interests rather than Lydia's, and that when the footprint cleared, what remained was mine, clean and uncontested. Alina stapled the last document set and slid it into a folder she labeled with a case number rather than a name. She had not once in 2 hours referred to Lydia by her first name. She said your wife when specificity required it and the opposing party when it didn't. I noticed that. I didn't comment on it, but I noticed. As I was gathering my briefcase, Alina said, "One more thing." I stopped. Aldridge's file on the financial transfers, the $81,000 moving from your household account to Marsh's business entity. She looked at me steadily. That's not just marital waste. Depending on how his LLC was structured and what those funds were used for, there's a potential argument for fraudulent transfer. Possibly wire fraud if the transfers were made under a material misrepresentation. I looked at her. Lydia wasn't telling you she was funding his debt obligations, Alina said. If she represented those transfers to you in any way or simply concealed them, knowing you'd have objected, that changes the legal character of the money. It's no longer just an affair. It's financial misconduct. The distinction mattered enormously. In a divorce proceeding, an affair is personal history. Financial misconduct is a cause of action. How far can you take that argument? I asked. Alina picked up her pen. How precise do you want to be? I told her I wanted the full picture before I decided. She said she'd have a preliminary memo within the week. I left her office at 11:47, rode the elevator down 31 floors, and walked out onto the street into a gray Seattle morning. My driver was waiting. I sat in the back seat and looked at my phone for the first time since the meeting had started. 14 text messages, 11 from Lydia, 3 from Beatrice. I read none of them. What I did read, 30 minutes later when I was back in my own office, was an alert from my social media monitoring service, a tool I use to track mentions of my company name and developments in my portfolio markets. It had flagged something new. Not a trade publication, not a zoning board announcement. A post from a private account I recognized as belonging to one of Lydia and Beatrice's shared social circle. A long, carefully written post, clearly informed by a conversation with someone close to the situation, describing the marriage of a prominent Seattle developer as a decade of emotional neglect, financial control, and deliberate isolation. It had been up for 6 hours. It had been shared 43 times. I sat back in my chair and read it twice. She wanted a public war. She had no idea she was bringing a narrative to a document fight. There is a particular kind of person who mistakes visibility for power, who believes that controlling the story people see is the same as controlling the outcome. I've encountered that person in business more times than I can count. The developer who calls a press conference before he secured his financing, the partner who leaks favorable projections before the numbers are real, the competitor who builds his reputation on narrative instead of performance. They tend to do well for a specific window of time, long enough to feel invincible, not long enough to understand what's coming. Lydia had watched me operate for 22 years. She understood leverage, understood optics, understood that in certain circles perception moves faster than fact. What she had never fully absorbed, because she had always been on the benefiting side of it, was that perception without documentation is a structure built on nothing. It looks solid from the street. It doesn't survive inspection. The campaign began 48 hours after the birthday dinner. By the time I became fully aware of its scope, it had been running for 4 days. It started with that first shared post, the one my monitoring service flagged on the Wednesday after the dinner. A mutual acquaintance, a woman named Portia who hosted an annual fundraising gala that Lydia and I had attended 6 consecutive years, had written a long, emotionally textured account of a conversation she'd had with Lydia over the past difficult months. The post didn't name me. It described a woman of warmth and grace who had spent years inside a marriage, defined by a husband's compulsive prioritization of work over presence, missed anniversaries, canceled plans, a partner who communicated in financial gestures rather than genuine intimacy. The post was well written, specific enough to feel credible, vague enough to be legally untouchable. It had the emotional architecture of something that had been drafted carefully, not dashed off in grief. They painted me as the villain. I let them paint. By Thursday, 3 more accounts had posted variations on the same theme. A former colleague of Lydia's from her years on a nonprofit board, a woman from her Pilates circle, and then, on Friday morning, Beatrice herself, posting from her own verified account with a following of several thousand, built on years of lifestyle content and charity work optics. Beatrice's post was different in character. It was shorter, sharper, and considerably less artful about what it was trying to accomplish. It described her sister as a woman who had finally found the courage to stop disappearing inside someone else's ambition. It described her brother-in-law, still unnamed, but identifiable to anyone inside their social world, as a man who had confused ownership with partnership. It ended with a line that had clearly been written to travel. Some people build empires by making everyone around them smaller. That line was shared 216 times inside 48 hours. Sympathy online is cheap. Evidence in court is expensive. I read Beatrice's post in my office on Friday morning with a cup of coffee, and the same forensic attention I give to a contract clause that's designed to sound benign. I read it for what it was trying to do legally, socially, and strategically. Legally, it was careful, nothing actionable on its face. Socially, it was effective within its target audience, which was the specific stratum of Seattle society where Lydia and Beatrice had spent decades building relationships I had largely funded. Strategically, it was the opening move of a negotiation disguised as an emotional confession. They were establishing a public record of victimhood before any legal proceedings began, creating a sympathetic backdrop against which any aggressive posture I took in the divorce would read as confirmation of the narrative. If I moved quickly on assets, I was the controlling husband she described. If I responded publicly, I was the reactive man who couldn't handle accountability. If I stayed silent, the narrative filled the vacuum unchallenged. It was not unsophisticated. I gave them that. What it wasn't, however, was new. I had watched this exact playbook executed in 2 separate business disputes over the course of my career. The pre-litigation narrative campaign, designed to soften the ground before the legal machinery engaged. The difference in those cases was that the people running the playbook understood they were in a strategic contest and calibrated accordingly. Lydia and Beatrice were running it emotionally, which meant they were running it imprecisely. An imprecision in any contest is an invitation. She wanted a public war. She had no idea she was bringing a knife to a drone strike. I forwarded Beatrice's post to a leaner at 7:43 in the morning with a single line. See the Beatrice Alderman post from today. Note the characterization language. Does this affect our posture? Elena responded in 11 minutes. It helps us. Archive everything. Do not respond publicly. Do not contact either of them directly. I'll explain Thursday. I archived everything. Over the following week, I watched the campaign develop with a degree of professional detachment that I suspect would have disturbed Lydia if she'd known about it. My assistant, who was aware of the broad situation, enough to be useful, not enough to be a liability, compiled a daily summary of new posts, shares, and comment activity across all relevant accounts. I reviewed each summary the way I review market reports, dispassionately, looking for signals rather than reacting to noise. What the summaries showed me across 8 days of escalating content was a campaign with a structural problem. It was growing faster than it could be controlled. Portia's initial post had been measured. Beatrice's had been sharper. The accounts that followed were sharper still, some of them people I barely recognized, amplifying details they couldn't have known firsthand, which meant the story was being actively fed to them and inevitably distorted in the retelling. By the end of the second week, there were posts describing specific incidents. A missed birthday, a canceled vacation. An argument witnessed by a dinner party guest, some of which were grounded in reality and some of which were plainly constructed. When a narrative grows that fast, it stops being a story and becomes a liability. Details multiply, versions diverge. People who are performing sympathy start performing facts, and facts, unlike feelings, can be checked. The Thursday meeting with Alina clarified the full picture. She had reviewed the complete archive my assistant had compiled. She had also, independently, had a paralegal pull all publicly accessible posts and screenshots into a timestamped documentation package that now ran to 47 pages. She placed it on the desk between us with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had expected exactly this outcome. "Here is what they've done," Alina said. "They've created a public record. Every post, every share, every comment from an identifiable account is now a discoverable document in litigation. If this proceeds to contested divorce proceedings, and I expect it will, this material becomes relevant on multiple grounds." She walked me through them. Defamation exposure on the posts that had crossed from vague characterization into specific false factual claims. Admissibility questions around statements Lydia's associates had made on her behalf that could be characterized as authorized representations. And most usefully, the pattern of coordinated timing across multiple accounts, which suggested a deliberate campaign rather than organic expressions of personal support, a distinction that mattered if we ever needed to argue intent. "They wanted to control the narrative before you could," Alina said. "What they've actually done is hand us a documented timeline of premeditated reputational attack. That's useful." She paused, then added, "Beatrice, specifically, may have a problem. That line about building empires by making people smaller, we may be able to demonstrate that refers specifically to you, that it's false, and that she knew it was false when she wrote it. That's not a guaranteed claim, but it's a pressure point." I thought about Beatrice, her self-satisfied expression at the birthday dinner, the particular pleasure she'd taken in the staging of that evening, which I now understood she had known about in advance, possibly helped plan. "Note it," I said. "Don't move on it yet." Alina noted it. What I had not shared with Alina, not yet, was a piece of information Aldridge had delivered the previous Monday that I was still processing for its strategic implications. Donovan's private lender situation had deteriorated further in the weeks since the birthday dinner. The Portland holding company pursuing him had escalated from demand letters to formal legal action. A civil complaint had been filed in Multnomah County. The amount in dispute was $140,000. The complaint alleged not only non-payment but misrepresentation in the original loan application. Specifically, that Donovan had overstated his business revenue and client base to secure the loan terms. Aldridge had obtained a copy of the complaint through the public court record. He had also obtained, through methods I did not ask him to detail, a summary of Donovan's current account activity. In the 60 days since the birthday dinner, 3 additional transfers had moved from Lydia's personal discretionary account to Meridian Somatic Arts LLC. $47,000 in total. She was still funding him. Even now, even after the dinner, even after I had walked out and gone silent, she was still sending money to a man who was being sued for financial fraud in another state. I didn't get mad, I got documented. She wasn't just in an affair. She was financing a liability with escalating legal exposure, drawing from funds that were still nominally joint, in a window that Alina and I had not yet fully closed. Every dollar that moved in that period would eventually land on a table in front of attorneys and require explanation. Lydia thought the dinner had been her declaration. She thought my silence afterward was the quiet of a man who was wounded, retreating, scrambling to process what had happened. She thought the 43 text messages she'd sent and the social media campaign she and Beatrice were running were operating in a vacuum, that she was controlling the pace and I was simply reacting to it. She had no idea that while she was crafting posts and briefing sympathetic friends and wiring money to a man with a fraud complaint filed against him in Oregon, I was 6 weeks from being done. The trap wasn't set the night of the birthday dinner. It had been set 4 months before. The dinner was simply the evening I let her see it. But there's a moment in every demolition when the subject of it stops being passive, when the pressure of an escalating situation drives a miscalculation. Lydia's miscalculation came on a Tuesday morning in November, when she walked through the lobby of my corporate headquarters in a Chanel coat with Beatrice at her side and demanded, in front of my entire front-of-house staff, to speak to me immediately about what she called a financial emergency. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't call ahead. She came to my building on my terms, into a space where every camera was running and every employee knew who I was and what I had built. Desperation, it turns out, wears expensive perfume. I want to tell you something about commercial real estate that most people outside the industry don't fully appreciate. The building is never just the building. When you acquire a property, you're not simply buying square footage and a roof. You're buying a position, a set of rights, obligations, and leverage points that extend in every direction, over the tenants who depend on the space, over the surrounding market, over the future of every business operating within those walls. A lease is not a neutral document. It is a relationship in which one party holds structural authority over the other, and the only question is whether that authority is ever exercised. I have purchased 41 commercial properties in my career. I have exercised that authority exactly 4 times. Each time, it was because the situation required precision rather than patience. Each time, the outcome was resolved on my terms. The Capitol Hill acquisition was the 42nd property, and it would be the 5th time I exercised what the lease agreement described, in clean contractual language, as the landlord's right to enforce. Donovan thought he was taking my wife. I was taking his livelihood. Let me go back to the beginning of that particular thread, because the acquisition didn't start as retaliation. It started as real estate. I had been watching a 2-block stretch of Capitol Hill for the better part of 18 months before any of this began. The neighborhood had been in a slow but unmistakable transition. Older commercial stock, underutilized ground floors, landlords who had owned their buildings for decades and were reaching the age where management fatigue outpaced attachment. The demographics of the surrounding residential density were shifting upward. Foot traffic patterns on the primary corridor had strengthened 2 consecutive quarters. The fundamentals were pointing in one direction. There were 3 buildings on that stretch worth considering. One had structural issues I couldn't price confidently. One had a tenant mix that would require expensive lease terminations to reposition. The third, a 4-story mixed-use building with ground and second-floor commercial units and 12 residential apartments above, was owned by a retired civil engineer named Harold who had managed it himself for 31 years and was, by the time Aldridge's report landed on my desk in August, deeply tired of doing so. Harold had not listed the building. He didn't need to. In a market like Seattle, owners of his profile receive unsolicited offers regularly from investors who track public records and identify candidates through exactly the kind of analysis my acquisitions team performs routinely. I had Harold's building on a watch list before I knew Donovan existed. When Aldridge's report identified the address of Meridian Somatic Arts LLC, Unit 4B of Harold's building, 2nd floor, month-to-month lease, $4,200 per month, 3 months in arrears at the time of the report. The coincidence was so clean it took me a moment to confirm I was reading it correctly. I called my acquisitions director that afternoon and told him to move Harold's building from watch list to active pursuit. I did not tell him why the timeline had accelerated. He didn't ask. Revenge isn't loud. It's signing a deed in black ink. The negotiation with Harold took 11 days. He was not a complicated seller. He wanted a fair price, a clean close, an assurance that the residential tenants, several of whom had lived in the building for over a decade, would not be displaced on short notice. I gave him all three without negotiation on the tenant assurance because I had no interest in the residential floors. My interest was singular and specific and occupied 1,400 square feet on the second floor. We closed on a Monday in late September. The purchase price was $4.1 million, which was within the range my team had modeled and below what the building would fetch in an open market process. Harold was satisfied. I was satisfied. The transaction was recorded with the county, as all transactions are, in the public property database, available to anyone who searched for it, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. Donovan was not looking. The entity that now held title to his building was called Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC, a name Alina had chosen with a precision I appreciated only when she explained it. Meridian was a common enough word in the wellness and real estate sectors that it would not immediately flag as connected to anything. Pacific was geographic, generic. Holdings was standard. Nothing in the entity name pointed toward me, toward my existing portfolio, or toward any relationship with the tenant in Unit 4B. Alina had also structured the entity with a registered agent and a management company as the point of contact for all tenant communications. Donovan would receive correspondence from a property management firm. He would pay his rent, when he paid it, to a bank account belonging to Meridian Pacific Holdings. My name would appear nowhere in any document he encountered. He called himself a guru. I called him a tenant. He just didn't know it yet. What I want to be precise about is the distinction between what I was doing and what it might superficially resemble. This was not a trap in the conventional sense. I was not manufacturing a situation. I was not engineering a false circumstance designed to harm someone who had done nothing wrong. Donovan had done considerable wrong. He had entered my marriage under false pretenses, extracted a significant sum of money from my household through a woman he had deliberately targeted at a point of emotional vulnerability, and done so while carrying concealed financial liabilities that made his entire operation, the studio, the retreats, the curated persona of enlightened wellness, a performance designed to sustain access to the funding he needed to survive. What I was doing was positioning myself legally and structurally so that when the moment of resolution arrived, I held every relevant lever. The building was one lever. The financial documentation was another. Alina's restructured legal instruments were a third. Aldridge's surveillance file was a fourth. You don't negotiate with a hostage taker when you already hold the keys to the building. The month-to-month lease was, in retrospect, the single most useful feature of the entire arrangement. Harold had allowed it to lapse to month-to-month 2 years prior when Donovan had requested flexibility during what he described as a transitional period for his business. Harold, being a reasonable man who disliked confrontation, had agreed. The result was a lease that required 30 days written notice to terminate, with no renewal rights, no extension options, and no obligation on the landlord's part to justify the decision. Alina reviewed the lease document the week after closing and used the word clean 3 times in the space of a single paragraph. For Alina, that was effusive. Through October and into November, while Lydia and Beatrice ran their social media campaign, and Donovan continued operating his studio in apparent ignorance of who now owned the building beneath him, I watched Aldridge's updates accumulate with the patience of someone who understands that a well-structured position doesn't require rushing. The financial picture around Donovan had continued to deteriorate. The Multnomah County civil complaint was progressing. His studio revenue, never robust, had thinned further as the novelty of his offering faded in a neighborhood with a saturated wellness market. The 3 additional transfers from Lydia's account $47,000 across October and early November, had slowed but not stopped. She was, by Aldridge's estimate, the source of approximately 60% of the cash flowing through Meridian Somatic Arts LLC in its operational lifetime. Without Lydia, Donovan's business did not function. Without Donovan's business, Donovan had no income, no professional identity, and no mechanism for managing his debt obligations. The entire structure of his financial life rested on continued access to her resources, which meant it rested, indirectly, on continued access to mine. I had been funding my own betrayal for the better part of a year. That fact sat with me in a particular way, not with bitterness, because bitterness is a tax on the person paying it, but with a cold, clarifying anger that I found useful. It kept my focus narrow. It kept me precise. The numbers never lie, and what the numbers were saying by mid-November was that Donovan was not a man having an affair. He was a man running an extraction operation, and Lydia was both his primary asset and his most significant risk, because Lydia was attached to someone who audited everything. There is one more element of the Capitol Hill acquisition that I have not mentioned yet, and I want to place it here, because its significance becomes clear only in the context of everything that follows. When Alina finalized the entity structure for Meridian Pacific Holdings, she included a standard set of commercial lease clauses in the template she prepared for any future tenant communications, standard language covering rent arrears, lease violations, and the landlord's right to terminate for cause or convenience. All of it was boilerplate. All of it was enforceable. She also included, at my request, a specific clause governing permitted use of the commercial space. The permitted use for Unit 4B was defined as general professional office and wellness services, subject to maintenance of all applicable business licenses, professional certifications, and compliance with local operating regulations. Aldridge had already identified that Donovan's business certifications were, to use Alina's characterization, aspirationally described on his website relative to what the state of Washington's professional licensing database actually showed. His credentials as a somatic practitioner were based on a certification from a private training organization in California that was not accredited by any recognized professional body. For most purposes, that was irrelevant. Wellness coaching occupied a largely unregulated space. But as a lease compliance matter, in a building now owned by an entity whose management company took lease terms seriously, it created an opening. Alina flagged it in a memo dated the week after closing. She wrote, "Note for file. Permitted use clause may provide independent grounds for lease termination separate from arrears, if and when termination becomes strategically appropriate. Recommend holding this instrument until optimal moment." I had read that memo 3 times. I kept it in a separate folder, physical not digital, in the top left drawer of my desk at the office. By mid-November, that folder had 4 documents in it: the lease, Alina's memo, Aldridge's certification analysis, and the 30-day termination notice, already drafted, already dated, signed by the management company on behalf of Meridian Pacific Holdings LLC. It was not yet delivered. The timing mattered. Alina had been clear about that from the beginning. The termination notice was not a weapon to deploy in isolation. It was the final instrument in a sequence. And sequences, as I had learned building 42 properties across 20 years, only work when every preceding step has been executed correctly. The preceding steps were nearly complete. The mediation date had not yet been set. Lydia had not yet made her most expensive mistake. Donovan had not yet understood what was coming. But the notice was ready. Signed, dated, sitting in a drawer in a building 12 blocks from the studio where he was, at that very moment, teaching a Tuesday evening session on releasing what no longer serves you. The irony of that was not lost on me. What was coming next would not come from me directly. It would come from Lydia, who, in the third week of November, walked into my building and issued an ultimatum she had no legal standing to make, in front of witnesses she had not considered, armed with leverage she did not actually possess. She thought she was forcing my hand. She had no idea my hand had been ready for months. There is a concept in negotiation called the false deadline. It's a pressure tactic. The other party introduces urgency they don't actually possess. Hopping the manufactured tension will force a concession before you've had time to assess whether the threat is real. I have encountered it in boardrooms, across closing tables, in zoning hearings where the opposing counsel needed a decision before my team had finished reading the fine print. It works on people who haven't prepared. It works on people who are reacting instead of executing. It works, specifically, on people who have something to lose and haven't yet secured it. By the third week of November, I had secured everything worth securing. Which is why, when my assistant called my desk at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning and said, with careful professional neutrality, that my wife had arrived in the lobby with her sister and was requesting an immediate meeting, I told her to let them wait exactly 12 minutes, then show them to the second-floor conference room. Not my office. The conference room. The distinction mattered. Then I called Eleanor. She answered on the second ring. I told her what was happening in approximately 40 words. Eleanor was quiet for 3 seconds, which, for her, constituted a considered pause. "Don't engage on substance," she said. "Let her talk. Don't confirm, don't deny, don't negotiate. If she makes a specific demand, write it down and tell her your attorney will respond. That's all." "Understood." "Desmond," a brief pause. "Is there anyone else in the building who should be aware of the situation before they walk through it?" I told her I'd handle it. I called my head of operations, gave him a 2-sentence briefing, and asked him to ensure the lobby security log captured the arrival time and the names of both visitors. Standard procedure for any unscheduled guest. Completely defensible. Completely documented. Then I straightened my jacket, took the stairs to the second floor, and opened the conference room door. Desperation wears expensive perfume. Lydia was standing at the window when I entered, her back partially to the door, looking out at the view with the posture of someone who had rehearsed the entrance. She wore a charcoal wrap coat I recognized, a Paris purchase from 3 years prior, one of those pieces she reserved for occasions requiring a particular kind of authority. Beatrice sat at the conference table, a leather portfolio open in front of her, pen in hand, performing the role of the organized one. I noted the portfolio. I noted the pen. Neither of them had brought an attorney. That told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they had prepared for this moment versus how seriously they had prepared for the performance of it. I closed the door, remained standing, and said, "Lydia." She turned from the window. Her expression had been assembled carefully, composed, aggrieved, the precise emotional register of a woman who believed she occupied the moral high ground and wanted that belief to land in the room before any words did. She was still beautiful. She had always been that. It had nothing to do with anything relevant. "You've been avoiding me for 3 weeks," she said. "I've been working," I said. "Sit down." She held the standing position for a moment, another rehearsed beat, then moved to the chair across from Beatrice and sat. I took the chair at the head of the table, not to make a point, because it was my building, my conference room, and the head of the table was where I sat. Beatrice opened her mouth. "Beatrice," I said without looking at her, "I'm not here to speak with you. If you'd like to observe, you're welcome to stay. If you'd like to contribute, you can call my attorney and schedule a proper meeting." Beatrice closed her mouth. First time for everything. Lydia spoke for approximately 11 minutes without significant interruption. I had decided in advance to let her complete the full statement before responding to any of it, partly because Eleanor had advised it, and partly because I understood that the full statement was the point, not for my benefit, but for hers. She needed to say all of it. The shape of what she said would tell me more than the content. The substance compressed was this. She was aware of the trust restructuring. She had spoken to an attorney unnamed, which suggested preliminary consultation rather than retained counsel, who had told her the restructuring appeared designed to disadvantage her in a divorce proceeding. She believed she was entitled to a significant portion of the marital estate, which she characterized at various points as what I'm owed, what any court would give me, and basic fairness after 22 years. She had a figure in mind. She did not state it directly for the first 8 minutes, which is a common negotiating behavior among people who have been told their number is aggressive, and our hopping context will soften it before delivery. The figure when she arrived at it was $14 million. A clean settlement, she said. No contested proceedings, no depositions, no prolonged litigation. In exchange, she would instruct her attorney, once retained, to pursue an uncontested dissolution. She would also, she said, with a particular emphasis that was meant to register as meaningful, discontinue any public commentary about our marriage. There it was, the silence she was selling. $14 million to stop the social media campaign she and Beatrice had spent 3 weeks building. She threatened to take half. I had already made sure there was no half to take. I had written 3 things on the legal pad in front of me while she spoke: the figure, the word uncontested, and a small notation in the margin that read, "No attorney present." When she finished, I looked at her for a moment without speaking. Not for effect, because I wanted to be certain I had the full picture before I said anything that would become part of a record. "I hear you," I said. Lydia blinked. She had expected either capitulation or confrontation. A quiet acknowledgement of receipt was not in her prepared responses. "I want to make sure I understand what you're proposing," I continued. "You're offering to settle the dissolution of our marriage for $14 million, and in exchange you'll discontinue public statements about our relationship. Is that an accurate summary?" Yes, that's what I'm saying." "And if I decline?" She straightened. "Then we go through the courts, and everything becomes public. Everything you've done, every asset you've hidden, every—" "Lydia," my voice stayed level, "I haven't hidden anything. I've restructured. Those are legally distinct actions, and I'd encourage you to have whatever attorney you've spoken with explain the difference before you repeat that characterization in a context where it creates exposure for you." Beatrice shifted in her chair. "What I'm going to do," I said, "is have my attorney contact yours, once you've retained one, to discuss the appropriate process for proceeding. I'm not going to negotiate this in my conference room without counsel present, and I'd strongly advise you not to either." I stood. Lydia gave me an ultimatum. I gave her a reality check. She didn't move immediately. There was a moment, a few seconds, in which the architecture of the meeting she had planned collided with the meeting that had actually occurred, where she looked at me with something beneath the composed exterior. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that had been accumulating for longer than 4 months, longer than the affair, longer perhaps than either of us had names for. "You're not even going to acknowledge it," she said, quietly. The rehearsed register had dropped. "Acknowledge what?" "That you were gone, that you have been gone for years, that I stopped existing to you somewhere between the 3rd acquisition and the 4th. The room was very still. I could have said several things. I thought of Aliner's phrase, "the problem is structural," and understood in that moment exactly what she had meant. Lydia was not entirely wrong. The marriage had hollowed out gradually over years through accumulated absences and substituted gestures and a mutual agreement, never spoken aloud, to stop asking whether the thing between us was still real. I had known that. I had chosen the company over the conversation, repeatedly, in ways I had justified as providing for her when the honest accounting was simpler and less flattering. But the knowledge that a structure has failed does not obligate you to hand it to the person who exploited the failure. Those are separate questions. You should have an attorney before we continue this conversation, I said. I mean that genuinely, not as a tactic. She looked at me for another moment, then stood, smoothed her coat with the particular precision of someone reassembling a composed exterior over a fractured one, and walked to the door. Beatrice gathered her portfolio, still blank, I noted, and followed. At the door, Lydia paused without turning around. I know about the restructuring, Desmond. My attorney will find everything. I'm counting on it, I said. They were in the building for 26 minutes. The lobby security log documented their arrival at 9:51 and their departure at 10:17. My assistant had prepared a written summary of the meeting within the hour, drafted from notes she had not been in the room to take, which told me she had, on her own professional initiative, ensured the conference room's standard recording function was active for the duration. I did not ask her to do that. I gave her a raise the following week. I forwarded the summary to Alina at 11:30 with a one-line message. They came in without counsel. 14 million demand. Referenced public commentary as leverage. Full summary attached. Alina's response came 40 minutes later and was 3 sentences. This is better than I expected. The leverage attempt around public commentary may constitute extortion depending on how it's characterized. I'll have a memo by end of week. That evening, I sat in my office after the building had emptied and looked at the folder in the top left drawer of my desk. The lease, the memo, the certification analysis, the 30-day termination notice. Lydia had come to my building believing she held leverage. What she had actually done was establish, in a documented meeting with a timestamped security log and a written summary, that she was willing to use a coordinated public campaign as a negotiating instrument in a dissolution proceeding. Alina's memo would spend considerable energy on the legal implications of that. The mediation date, which had not yet been set, was now the next fixed point on the horizon. Between now and then, 2 things remained. The termination notice, still sitting unsigned in that drawer, waiting for its moment in the sequence. And Donovan, who had spent 11 weeks operating his studio in a building he didn't know belonged to me, living a life he didn't know was about to end, teaching people how to release what no longer served them. The irony, even the second time, was not lost on me. Mediation has a particular atmosphere that courtrooms don't. A courtroom has ceremony. The formality of procedure creates a kind of distance between the participants and what is actually happening to them. Mediation has no such buffer. It is a conference table, fluorescent light softened by expensive fixtures, a neutral third party whose job is to prevent the proceedings from becoming something a judge will need to clean up later, and the people whose lives are being divided sitting close enough to each other to notice breathing patterns. Alina had selected the mediator, a former Superior Court judge named Hargrove, methodical, humorless, with a reputation for keeping sessions moving and a documented intolerance for theatrical behavior from either side. Alina had used him twice before. She described him as a man who had seen every version of human financial desperation and remained unmoved by all of them. For our purposes, she said, that was ideal. The session was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Thursday in early December. Alina and I arrived at 8:40. We were shown to a room on the 14th floor of a downtown mediation center, round-cornered table in pale wood, 8 chairs, a credenza with water, and coffee that no one would touch, large windows showing a gray Seattle sky sitting low over the bay. Alina set her briefcase on the table and opened it without speaking. She removed 4 document sets, each bound with a binder clip and tabbed with color-coded markers, and placed them in a precise row in front of her seat. Then she sat down, aligned her pen parallel to the legal pad she'd placed to her right, and looked at the door. I sat beside her and did the same. We waited. Lydia arrived at 9:04 with her attorney, a Seattle family law practitioner named Alderman Cross, whom Alina had identified as competent but conventional, someone who would work the standard playbook without the creative flexibility that complicated situations required. Behind them, and this was the first surprise of the morning, came Donovan. His attendance had not been confirmed in the pre-mediation correspondence. Alina had requested it, on grounds that his financial entanglement with the marital estate made his participation relevant to a complete resolution. Lydia's attorney had objected twice and ultimately conceded when Alina produced the transfer records demonstrating the flow of marital funds into his business entity. Donovan had retained his own counsel, a solo practitioner whose primary practice area, Alina had noted dryly in a briefing the night before, was commercial lease disputes. He walked in wearing a dark blazer over an open collar, a concession to the formality of the setting that still managed to look like a costume. He was thinner than the surveillance photos from August. The months had done something to the ease he'd worn at that birthday dinner, the loose-limbed confidence of a man who believed the geometry of his situation was working in his favor. What sat down across the table from me that morning was a man who had been running a calculation that wasn't adding up anymore, and was hopping. No one in this room could see the work. I could see the work. Hargrove entered at 9:10, introduced himself to the room in the tone of someone reading terms and conditions aloud, established ground rules in 3 minutes flat, and asked if both primary parties were prepared to proceed. Alina said yes. Lydia's attorney said yes. Hargrove looked at his legal pad. Then let's begin with asset disclosure. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Lydia's attorney presented their characterization of the marital estate, a figure that reflected the pre-restructuring asset picture, assembled from public records and financial disclosures that were several months out of date. It was a competent presentation of an incomplete picture, which is the best you can do when you haven't done the deeper work. Alina listened without expression, making occasional notes. When Alderman Cross finished, Hargrove turned to Alina. Respondent's position on asset characterization. Alina opened the first tabbed document set and slid a copy across the table to Alderman Cross, one to Hargrove, and placed one in front of me. She kept the fourth in front of herself. Our asset characterization reflects the current legal structure of all relevant holdings, she said. The trusts, corporate entities, and real property interests are documented in full in the package you've received. We'll note for the record that all restructuring was executed in accordance with Washington state law and the terms of the parties' prenuptial agreement, which we've included as Exhibit A. Alderman Cross flipped to Exhibit A. Something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The particular micro-adjustment of an attorney encountering a document that is more solid than anticipated. Lydia leaned toward her attorney and said something quietly. Alderman Cross put a hand briefly on her arm. This was the first 20 minutes of what followed, the procedural layer, the necessary groundwork. Alina had explained it to me the night before with characteristic precision. You don't open with the most significant evidence. You establish the legal foundation first, so that when the more consequential material arrives, it lands on a surface that has already been properly prepared. At the 43-minute mark, Hargrove suggested a brief recess. Alina declined on our behalf. We'd prefer to continue, she said. We have additional material to introduce, and I'd rather the session maintain momentum. Hargrove noted it. Lydia's attorney had no objection. Alina reached into her briefcase and removed a second document package. This one was not bound with a binder clip. It was a manila folder, unmarked on the outside, thick enough that it made a distinct sound when she placed it on the table. She did not open it immediately. She looked at Hargrove. We'd like to introduce financial transfer records relevant to the characterization of marital waste and potential misconduct in the management of marital assets, she said. These records have been authenticated by a forensic accountant whose credentials and methodology are documented in the supplementary exhibit. I didn't raise my voice. I just slid the folder across the mahogany. Alina opened it and dealt the contents across the table with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has rehearsed the sequence. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, the annotated forensic accounting summary, and then, placed last, face up, Aldridge's surveillance documentation, photographs dated and time-stamped, the complete financial trace from the first $15,000 wire to the most recent transfer 11 days before mediation. The room was quiet. Lydia looked at the photograph on top of the stack for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Her expression was not the composed, rehearsed register she'd worn in my conference room 3 weeks prior. It was something underneath all of that. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of a person seeing the full shape of something they had assumed was invisible. That was the exact moment Lydia realized she was bankrupt. Alderman Cross asked for 15 minutes to review the materials. Hargrove granted it. During those 15 minutes, Lydia sat very still while her attorney read. Donovan's attorney leaned close to him and spoke in a low, continuous murmur. Donovan stared at the transfer records in front of him with the focused attention of a man calculating distances. Alina poured herself a glass of water, drank half of it, and made 2 additional notes on her legal pad. I watched Donovan. There is a particular behavioral shift that occurs when a cornered person finishes their assessment and concludes that cooperation is cheaper than continued exposure. I have seen it in failed business partners, in contractors caught double billing, in one city official whose involvement in a permitting irregularity became clear midway through a deposition. The shift is subtle. The shoulders drop slightly. The jaw releases. The eyes begin moving toward the person in the room they've decided to sacrifice, rather than the person they've decided to align with. Donovan's eyes moved to Lydia. When you corner a grifter, they always sell out the easiest mark. At the 58-minute mark, Alina introduced the Multnomah County civil complaint. She presented it as contextual documentation relevant to the characterization of Donovan's financial relationship with Lydia. Specifically, the argument that the transfers from the marital account had not been romantic gifts, but operational funding for a business entity carrying concealed liabilities that Donovan had actively misrepresented to obtain. The complaint documents allegations of material misrepresentation in a loan application, Alina said to Hargrove. We are not adjudicating that matter here. We are introducing it to establish the financial context in which these transfers occurred and to support our position that the petitioner was not an informed participant in the disposition of these funds. Donovan's attorney objected on relevance grounds. Hargrove overruled it in one sentence. Alderman Cross looked at Lydia again. Lydia was looking at Donovan. He didn't look back. Alina placed one more document on the table. A single page, a letter on the letterhead of a property management company addressed to Meridian Somatic Arts, LLC, Unit 4B, Capitol Hill, Seattle. For completeness of the financial picture, Alina said, we'd like to note that the commercial property currently housing Mr. Marsh's business was acquired in September of this year by an entity in which my client holds a controlling interest. This letter represents a 30-day notice of lease termination, effective from the date of this session. The room registered this in different ways. Hargrove wrote something on his pad. Alderman Cross set down her pen. Lydia turned to look at Donovan with an expression I had not seen on her face before, not anger, not grief, but the specific look of a person realizing that the story they had been living was not the story that had actually been happening. Donovan's attorney put a hand on his client's arm. Donovan removed the hand. He looked at Alina, then at me. Something moved across his expression, not remorse, nothing that considered. It was the pragmatic recalibration of a man who had spent his entire adult life assessing which way the leverage ran and adjusting accordingly. He turned to Lydia. What he said in the next 4 minutes I will not recount in full, because some moments deserve a certain privacy, even in a story like this one. The compressed version is this. Donovan confirmed, in the presence of a former superior court judge serving as mediator, 2 attorneys and both parties to a dissolution proceeding, that his relationship with Lydia had been shaped significantly by his financial circumstances, that he had not disclosed the extent of his debt obligations to her, that certain representations he had made about his intentions and his feelings had been, in his own careful phrasing, influenced by the pressures of his situation. He said it in the language of a man who had been coached to minimize, which meant the truth behind it was considerably larger than what the words contained. But the words were enough. They were said in a documented proceeding, in front of a mediator whose notes would reflect them, in a room where Lydia had just watched $81,000 of her transferred funds laid out in chronological order on a pale wood table. The sound that came from Lydia was not a word. It was brief. She pressed her fingers to the edge of the table and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I didn't look away. I didn't offer anything, not comfort, not satisfaction, not the vindication she might have expected to find in my expression. I looked at her the way you look at the final page of a chapter you've been reading for a long time, with the particular quiet of someone who already knew how it ended. Eleanor set her pen down, aligned it with the legal pad, and addressed Hargrove. We're prepared to discuss settlement terms whenever the room is ready. The session continued for another 90 minutes. I will summarize what mattered. Lydia's position, without the leverage of a credible financial claim, and with the social media campaign now characterized in Eleanor's documentation as potential extortion, had collapsed to a fraction of its original posture. The prenuptial agreement held. The restructuring held. The marital waste argument based on the transfers gave Eleanor a counterposition that reduced Lydia's viable claim substantially. What Lydia walked away with was the family home, which Eleanor had already conceded was the cleanest resolution, and a settlement figure that was a fraction of the $14 million she had demanded in my conference room 3 weeks prior. Her attorney, to her credit, advised acceptance. Lydia accepted without speaking. Donovan left the room before the session formally concluded. His attorney followed him. Neither said anything on the way out. Eleanor gathered her documents in the same precise order she had placed them, returned them to her briefcase, and closed the clasp with a sound that was barely audible. I sat for a moment in the quiet of a room where everything had just been resolved, and nothing felt the way resolution is supposed to feel in the versions of this story people prefer. "You're done," Eleanor said, not unkindly. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a mediation session. Not the silence of resolution, that has a different texture, something looser, the particular exhale of a room where tension has been formally discharged. What follows a session like ours is a compressive silence, the kind that presses in from the walls of a conference room after the principals have dispersed, and the fluorescent light is still humming, and the pale wood table still holds the ghost of everything that was just laid across it. I sat in that silence for approximately 4 minutes after Eleanor closed her briefcase. Hargrove had left. Alderman Cross had walked Lydia out. Donovan and his attorney were already gone, had been gone for 20 minutes by the time the session formally concluded, which was its own kind of statement. Eleanor did not rush me. She understood, I think, that the completion of a thing and the processing of its completion are different events on different timelines, and that confusing them helps no one. When I stood, she stood. We rode the elevator down in silence. On the street, she turned up the collar of her blazer against the December air and looked at me with the directness that had been her consistent register across 4 months of the most consequential legal work of my personal life. "Breakfast," she said. It was not a question. We walked 3 blocks to a place she knew. I ordered coffee and did not look at the menu. What I want to tell you about Donovan's disclosure in that mediation room is not the content of it. I've given you the substance, the pragmatic calculation of a man choosing self-preservation over the pretense of dignity. What I want to tell you is what it looked like from where I was sitting, because the geometry of that moment said more than the words did. Lydia had spent months building a version of herself around the belief that she had found something real, that the grief she felt about our marriage, the accumulated weight of missed moments and substituted gestures and the slow erosion of being seen, had been answered by a person who actually looked at her. Not at what she represented, not at the life she provided access to, not at the financial infrastructure that surrounded her like a climate-controlled environment she'd long since stopped noticing. At her. She wanted him to fight for her. He didn't even stand up. What Donovan did, when a leaner placed the Multnomah County complaint on the table and the 30-day termination notice beside it, was perform a rapid and thorough audit of his available options. I recognize the behavior because I have done the same calculation in difficult negotiations. The moment when the position you entered a room with becomes untenable, and you have to decide in real time what you're willing to release in order to preserve what matters most. The difference between Donovan's calculation and mine is that what Donovan was willing to release was Lydia. He did it efficiently. There was almost something to respect in the efficiency, the way you might grudgingly respect a piece of engineering that accomplishes its purpose without waste. He didn't perform remorse he didn't feel. He didn't attempt a middle ground narrative where he'd had genuine feelings that were complicated by circumstances. He made a clean cut because a clean cut served him better than any alternative. The guru was just a parasite. I had known that since August. Aldridge's file had made it plain from the beginning: the predatory financial pattern, the manufactured persona, the calculated targeting of a woman at a specific point of vulnerability. I had known it intellectually for months. Watching it confirmed aloud in a mediation room, in Donovan's own words with Lydia sitting 3 feet from him, was a different kind of knowing. Alina told me the rest of what happened after I left the building in fragments over the following week, as the legal aftermath required our continued communication. I'll reconstruct it here as the complete picture, because it belongs to this chapter. Lydia and Alderman Cross had gone to a small conference room on the same floor while the session's final documentation was being processed. Alderman Cross, to her credit, had been direct with her client about the implications of what had just occurred, both legally and personally. The settlement terms were what they were. The prenuptial had held. The financial claim had been substantially reduced. The home was hers. The rest was gone. Lydia had asked, according to what Alderman Cross later shared through proper channels, one question about the legal proceedings, one question about the settlement figure, and then she had sat quietly for a long time before asking a third question that had nothing to do with the law. She asked whether Alderman Cross thought Donovan had ever meant any of it. Alderman Cross was a family law attorney. She had been in rooms with this question in various forms more times than she could count. She had developed, presumably, a calibrated response. I don't know what she said. I know that when Lydia left the building that afternoon, she left alone. Beatrice had not been present for the session, and the car that collected Lydia was a rideshare, not a town car, not a familiar driver, just an anonymous vehicle that appeared and took her somewhere. I thought about that detail more than I expected to, not with satisfaction, with something quieter and less comfortable than satisfaction. Donovan's situation resolved with a speed that reflected how little he had left to protect. The 30-day termination notice, delivered formally through the management company representing Meridian Pacific Holdings LLC, with no name attached, as clean and impersonal as a form letter, was received by his attorney within 48 hours of the mediation session. His attorney filed no challenge. There was no legal basis for one. The lease was month to month. The termination was procedurally correct. The permitted use clause violation Alina had flagged in September provided a secondary ground that made any challenge structurally futile before it began. Meridian Somatic Arts LLC ceased operations in Unit 4B on the 31st day following notice. The studio equipment, bolsters, sound equipment, a collection of crystals and singing bowls that I was told by the building manager required 3 trips to remove, was cleared in 2 days. The space was vacant by the first week of January. The Multnomah County civil case proceeded without Lydia's financial support, which meant Donovan had no mechanism for satisfying the judgment when it came. His attorney negotiated a payment plan with the lender's attorneys that consumed most of what he had. The Porsche, which Aldridge had confirmed was registered in Donovan's name and purchased in the same month as the third large transfer from Lydia's account, was sold as part of the asset liquidation. He called himself a guru. He left Seattle in February with a settlement debt, a vacated studio, and a professional reputation that had been thoroughly documented in court filings available to anyone who searched his name in the public record. The wellness industry in Seattle is not large. Word travels in specific directions within it. I did not need to say anything to anyone. The documents said everything. What I want to be precise about, because I think imprecision here would be a kind of dishonesty, is what I felt watching all of this conclude. People who hear the broad shape of this story expect a particular emotional resolution on my end. Triumph, maybe, or the clean satisfaction of a man who was wronged and responded with precision and watched the scales correct. Those feelings exist in versions of this story where the wronged party feels nothing complicated about the person who wronged them. I watched her heart break, and for the first time I felt nothing. That sentence is true, and it requires unpacking, because nothing is not the same as satisfaction, and it is not the same as indifference. Nothing is what you feel when the grief has already been processed in private, over months, in the specific silence of a marriage that had been emptying for years before either party formally acknowledged it. By the time I watched Lydia's face in that mediation room, I had already grieved the version of her I had married. I had already grieved the kitchen table conversations and the early years, and the woman who had once sat across from me when the company was an idea, and said things that I had believed with my whole chest. That grief was real. It had happened in the months between August and December, in the hours after Aldridge's updates, in the quiet of my office after the building emptied. It had happened without witnesses, which is the only way I know how to process anything that matters. By December, the grief was done. What remained was not hardness. It was clarity. And clarity, as I have said before, is the most functional state a person can occupy. But I want to be honest that functional is not the same as whole, and that the two are not always on the same timeline. There is a postscript to Lydia's story that came to me not through Alina or Aldridge, but through an unexpected source, Beatrice. 3 weeks after the mediation, Beatrice called my cell phone from a number I didn't recognize, which is how I know she understood I wouldn't answer a call from her directly. She left a voicemail. I listened to it once. It was not an apology precisely. Beatrice was not architecturally capable of a clean apology. The structure of her personality required too many qualifications and counter-grievances to allow for the unobstructed version. But somewhere inside the 4-minute message, between the defensive framing and the subtle repositioning of her own role in the preceding months, there was a sentence that landed differently than the rest. She said she really did believe he loved her, Desmond. I want you to know that, whatever else you think about all of it. I sat with that for longer than I expected to. I believed it. I had believed it since August, since I'd read Aldridge's profile and understood the specific mechanism of what Donovan had done, the way he had identified a woman carrying a particular kind of grief and offered himself as the answer to it. Lydia had not been careless with her heart. She had been targeted by someone who was skilled at locating the exact dimensions of a wound and presenting himself as the precise shape of its remedy. That didn't change the outcome. It didn't change the financial record or the mediation result or the termination notice or any of the structural facts of the preceding 6 months. But it changed the texture of the nothing I felt, made it something more specific. Not forgiveness, that was a longer road and not one I was ready to walk in December. Not sympathy in the conventional sense. Something closer to the understanding you feel for a person who made a bad investment in good faith, not knowing the prospectus was fraudulent. She had been looking for something real. She had found a performance, and the performance had cost her more than the money, more than the settlement, more than the social capital that had quietly evaporated in the weeks following the mediation. It had cost her the story she had told herself about what the last year of her life had meant. That is a specific kind of loss. I was not going to pretend it wasn't. Alina called me on a Friday evening in the second week of January. The final documentation from the dissolution had been filed and processed. Everything was complete. She had a few administrative items to cover, and then, she said, our professional engagement on this matter would be formally concluded. We covered the administrative items in 8 minutes. Then there was a pause in the conversation that was different in character from the pauses in our previous calls. Those pauses had been functional, the silence of two people reviewing documents, or one person waiting for the other to finish processing information before continuing. This pause was something else. It had a different weight. "How are you?" Alina asked. Not as a pleasantry. Alina did not use pleasantries. I thought about the question for a moment, with the seriousness it deserved. "Functional," I said. She was quiet for a beat. "Then that's a start." I found, unexpectedly, that I agreed with her. There is a rhythm to the aftermath of a controlled demolition that most people don't account for when they imagine what resolution looks like. They picture a moment, a door closing, a gavel landing, a final document signed, and they imagine that the moment contains the ending. What they don't picture is the weeks that follow, the administrative residue of a dismantled life. The quiet, undramatic sequence of accounts, closing and cards declining and forwarding addresses being filed with institutions that don't care about the story behind the change. Collapse doesn't happen with a bang. It happens when the card declines. I know this not because I watched it happen to Lydia in real time. I didn't. And I want to be clear that I was not monitoring her circumstances with any ongoing interest after the dissolution was finalized. I know it because Alina, in the course of closing out the administrative tale of our engagement, relayed certain practical developments as they became relevant to confirming the legal separation was clean. And because certain things simply became known, the way things become known in a city where the social circles you inhabited for 2 decades have a particular radius. What I can tell you is what the record shows. What the record shows is a woman who had lived inside a specific financial climate for 22 years. A climate I had built and maintained, stepping outside of it for the first time, and discovering that the temperature was considerably different than she had anticipated. The family home transferred title in the second week of January. Lydia had 90 days from the finalization of the dissolution to complete the transition, which her attorney had negotiated as a reasonable accommodation given the size of the property and the logistics of relocation. She did not use the full 90 days. She was out in 41. I don't know whether that speed reflected decisiveness or the particular discomfort of occupying a space that had become a monument to everything she was trying to leave behind. Probably both. The house had been ours in the way that large shared spaces become ours, filled with the accumulated objects of 2 decades, the furniture chosen together, the art acquired at openings we'd attended when the marriage still had a social life. Staying in it alone while that inventory was divided and removed would have been its own kind of extended suffering. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building on the east side of Capitol Hill. Not a building I owned. A building with a reasonable monthly rent that was, by the standards of the life she had occupied, modest in the specific way that feels like a verdict rather than just an address. She wanted freedom from my empire. I gave it to her. The financial picture of Lydia's new independence was not catastrophic in absolute terms. The settlement, though substantially reduced from her original demand, was not nothing. She had the proceeds from the family home, which carried real value in a Seattle market that had appreciated significantly over the 17 years of our ownership. She had personal assets, jewelry, accounts that were clearly her separate property, the inherited pieces from her family that had never been subject to any marital claim. What she did not have was the infrastructure, the corporate card that had covered the household accounts, the stylist, the memberships, the charity commitments, the particular ease of a life where the financial layer was simply always present and never required negotiation. That infrastructure had not been extravagant in the way that word usually implies. It had been functional, seamless, the kind of financial environment that becomes invisible precisely because it never fails. When it became visible, when the card that had worked without friction for 22 years was no longer in her wallet, when the accounts that had funded the texture of her daily life were closed and replaced by a single account with a balance she now had to actively manage, that visibility was, by all accounts, disorienting in ways she had not fully modeled when she imagined what leaving would feel like. Some lessons cost you your dignity. I did not derive pleasure from this. I want to say that plainly, because I think there is a version of this story where the narrator lingers in these details with a satisfaction that I do not feel and would not pretend to. What I felt, when these developments reached me through the ordinary channels of a small city's social knowledge, was a muted and complicated recognition. The recognition of someone watching the logical consequences of a series of choices unfold with the mathematical indifference of cause and effect. She had made choices. The choices had costs. That is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how consequential decisions operate in the world. Beatrice's situation deserves a brief accounting, because she had been an active participant in the preceding months, and the aftermath affected her as well. The social media campaign had not produced the outcome she'd engineered it to produce. In the weeks following the mediation, the narrative shifted, not through any public statement from me, because I made none, but through the particular mechanism of a story that stops being fed. Lydia and Beatrice had maintained the campaign on the energy of active cultivation. When the legal proceedings concluded unfavorably, and Donovan's disclosures became known within the social network they had spent months working, the story's center of gravity inverted. The posts remained online. They did not accumulate new shares. The sympathetic commentary thinned. The acquaintances who had amplified the narrative quietly recalibrated, not with apology, because that's not how social recalibration works, but with a gradual withdrawal of active support that left the original posts standing like structures whose foundations had been quietly removed. Beatrice's professional reputation, which was built on the careful management of her public image as a woman of taste and social standing, absorbed a measurable impact. 2 board positions she held with charitable organizations in the city experienced, within the first quarter of the new year, a reorganization of their membership committees that resulted in her stepping back from both. The language was always mutual and amicable. It always is. Alina had noted, in her final billing memo, that the defamation assessment she had prepared in November remained available should I choose to pursue it. I filed it without action. The collateral consequences of the collapsed narrative were sufficient. I had no interest in extending the engagement. Donovan left Seattle in February. I have already told you the broad facts. The studio closed, the assets liquidated, the debt obligations consuming what remained. What I have not told you is the specific detail that reached me through Aldridge's final summary report, which I had requested as a closeout on his engagement. In the last 2 weeks before he vacated Unit 4B, Donovan had made contact with Lydia 3 times. The first contact was a text message, content unknown. The second was a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. The third was a request, relayed through a mutual acquaintance, to meet for coffee. Lydia declined all three. I read that in Aldridge's report and set it down, and did not return to it for several days. When I did return to it, I found that it had shifted something in the way I was thinking about her. Not back toward the marriage, not toward any version of what we had been, but toward a more considered assessment of her character than the preceding months had allowed me to maintain. She had made choices I could not excuse and had not forgiven. She had also, when the performance ended and the man she had built a story around revealed himself clearly and asked her to continue anyway, said no. That no cost her something. It would have been easier emotionally, practically, in terms of the specific loneliness of a January in a 2-bedroom apartment after 22 years of a certain kind of life, to say yes. To accept whatever diminished version of the story Donovan was still capable of offering and use it to buffer the silence. She didn't. I noted it without conclusion. Some data points don't resolve into a position. They simply sit in the record, accurately observed. My own life in those months had the quality of a building site after the demolition crew has finished and before the foundation pour has begun. Cleared, quiet, full of potential that had not yet taken shape. I went to work. I closed 2 acquisitions that had been in the pipeline since October and had continued moving forward with the undisturbed momentum of deals that don't depend on the personal life of the developer. I attended the industry dinners that my position required. I ran 4 mornings a week along the waterfront, watching the light change over the bay in the way it does in January, flat and pewter, and somehow clarifying. I did not date. I was not ready to date. I was honest with myself about that in a way I had not always been honest with myself about what I was and wasn't ready for, and the honesty felt, on its own terms, like a kind of progress. Alina and I spoke twice in January, and once in early February on matters related to the final administrative closeout of the dissolution. The conversations were professional, efficient. They had the texture of our previous working relationship, except that they also had, in certain pauses, a quality that was different from anything in our previous working relationship, and I was aware of the difference without acting on it. She was finishing a significant case of her own in February, a corporate litigation matter that had been consuming most of her capacity for months. I knew this because she mentioned it once briefly in a context where it was relevant, and then did not mention it again. I thought about it more than once. The final item from Aldridge arrived in the 3rd week of February. A close-out memo, 4 pages, summarizing the complete engagement from the initial retainer in June through the dissolution finalization in January. Methodology, findings, documentation chain, confirmation that all surveillance and investigative materials had been handled in compliance with applicable law and were available for archiving or destruction at my direction. The last paragraph was a standard professional close. Aldridge thanked me for the engagement, noted his firm's availability for future work, and wished me well in the way that people who have spent 8 months inside your most private circumstances manage to do with genuine professionalism and genuine impersonality simultaneously. I authorized the archiving of the materials, sent the final payment, and closed the file. I sat for a moment with the particular sensation of a project that has been fully concluded, not the manufactured endings of dramatic moments, but the quiet administrative completion of something that had required sustained, disciplined attention across many months. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself, that arrives as a final checkbox rather than a climax. The empire was intact, more than intact. The 2 January acquisitions had added material value to a portfolio that the restructuring had clarified and strengthened. The legal position was clean. The documentation was archived. The people who had operated against my interests had encountered the consequences of doing so. Everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved. I was 53 years old, sitting in a quiet office in a building I owned, in a city whose skyline included the mark of work I had done over 2 decades, and the question of what came next was entirely open. That openness was unfamiliar. I had spent the better part of my adult life operating inside a defined structure: the marriage, the company, the acquisition pipeline, the managed complexity of a life whose every variable was known and accounted for. The openness felt like standing in the cleared footprint after a demolition. The ground was clean. The air was unobstructed. You don't rebuild on a rotten foundation. You pour new concrete. What I hadn't decided yet was what the new blueprint looked like. I had some ideas. One of them had been developing slowly, without announcement, across 4 months of working dinners and encrypted files, and a professional relationship that had quietly become the most honest one in my life. Alina's case concluded in the last week of February. She called on a Thursday evening, and the conversation lasted longer than any of our previous calls, and it had nothing to do with the dissolution. And when she said goodnight, there was a quality to the silence before she hung up that I recognized from the better moments of my life. The moments when something real is beginning rather than ending. I want to tell you something about the word equal, because I've been thinking about it for the better part of a year, and I think I finally understand what it means in practice versus what I always assumed it meant in theory. I had believed, for most of my adult life, that what I offered in a relationship was sufficient by virtue of its scale, that the financial architecture I built around the people I cared about constituted a form of presence, that providing at the level I provided was itself a language, fluent, expressive, complete. I had mistaken magnitude for meaning so consistently, and for so long that the mistake had become invisible to me, the way the background hum of a building's HVAC system becomes invisible until the day it stops. What I had never experienced, before the year that followed the dissolution, was a relationship in which the other person brought something to the table that I genuinely could not replicate, could not purchase, and could not manage my way around. A relationship where the dynamic was not provider and recipient but two people of equivalent weight, sitting across from each other with complete clarity about what each of them was and what each of them required. That is what equal means in practice, not symmetry of assets or equivalence of income or the performed balance of two people pretending their contributions are identical when they aren't. It means that when you sit across from someone, you feel the specific gravity of their presence as a counterweight to your own. You can't maneuver around them. You can only be honest with them. Alina had that gravity. She had always had it. It had taken me 4 months of working alongside her in the most consequential circumstances of my personal life to understand that what I was responding to was not just professional admiration. The Thursday evening call in late February lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. I know the duration because I noted it, not deliberately, but because I glanced at the clock when she said goodnight and did the arithmetic without meaning to. We talked about her case. The corporate litigation that had consumed her since October had concluded with a verdict that was, by her characterization, correct rather than satisfying, which she explained was the most honest outcome available in a situation where the law had been technically followed and the spirit of it had been thoroughly violated. I listened to her describe it and recognized the specific frustration of someone who had performed their function with precision and was nonetheless dissatisfied because precision had limits that excellence could not overcome. I told her I understood that feeling. She said she knew I did. There was something in that exchange, the economy of it, two people who had earned the right to skip the explanatory scaffolding, that felt like a door opening into a room I hadn't known was there. We talked about a development parcel I was evaluating on the south waterfront. She had an opinion about the zoning history of that corridor that was, characteristically, more informed than I had anticipated. We disagreed about the timing of the approach. The disagreement was direct and without performance, and she did not soften her position when I pushed back, and I did not resent her for it. And at the end of the exchange, I had genuinely updated my thinking. That had not happened in a conversation with Lydia in longer than I could accurately remember. When she said goodnight and the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my apartment. I had moved from the family home into a place of my own in January, a clean space with good light and no accumulated history, and thought about what the preceding 2 hours had felt like. It had felt like being met. I asked her to dinner in March, not through implication or professional adjacency or the careful social engineering of a man who isn't sure of his footing. Directly, in a text message, on a Tuesday morning, with the same clarity I would use to make an offer on a property I had decided I wanted. She was quiet for 6 hours. I did not interpret the silence as reluctance. Alina processed decisions at her own pace and communicated them when she was ready, and I had learned over the preceding months that attempting to accelerate her timeline was both ineffective and unnecessary. Her response when it came was 4 words: "Thursday, you choose where." I chose a restaurant overlooking the water, not the Sterling Club. I had no interest in that particular address carrying any weight in what I was beginning. A smaller place, quieter, the kind of room where the lighting is calibrated for conversation rather than performance, and the tables are spaced far enough apart that you can speak without managing the volume. We met at 7. She wore a dark blazer over a silk blouse, the professional register slightly relaxed, a version of her I hadn't seen before, and I noticed the distinction the way you notice a building in different light. The structure is the same. The quality of the illumination changes what you see. We ordered without consulting each other on the choices, which sounds like a small thing and isn't. It means neither person is performing accommodation. It means both people know what they want. The dinner lasted 3 hours. I am not going to give you a transcript of it, because some things belong to the people who were in the room. What I will tell you is the character of it, the texture that distinguished it from every formal dinner I had sat through in the preceding decade. No performance, no managed presentation of a self designed to produce a desired response, no subtext requiring translation. Alina said what she thought. I said what I thought. We disagreed twice and found the disagreements more interesting than the agreements, which is the reliable sign of a conversation happening between 2 people rather than 2 personas. She asked me at some point in the second hour what I had learned from the preceding year. Not about the legal process or the financial mechanics, she knew those better than anyone. About myself. I thought about it for a moment with the seriousness the question deserved. I told her I had learned that I had used my company the way some people use distance, as a managed buffer between myself and the vulnerability of being genuinely known by another person. That the financial architecture I had built around my marriage had been, in part, a substitute for a kind of presence I found more difficult to sustain than any negotiation I had ever sat through. That I had been, in the most honest accounting of it, more comfortable managing complexity from behind a desk than sitting across from someone without anything between us. Alina listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "That's an unusually precise self-assessment." I said, "I've had time to prepare it." She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile without the professional register framing it, and it changed the geometry of her face in a way I found I wanted to look at for a long time. You don't rebuild on a rotten foundation. You pour new concrete. And the concrete I was standing on that evening felt, for the first time in longer than I could honestly calculate, completely solid. The year that followed that dinner is the part of this story I am least equipped to summarize efficiently, because it did not move with the clean sequential logic of a business transaction or a legal proceeding. It moved the way real things move, with reversals and adjustments and moments of uncertainty and longer stretches of something that I can only describe as a sustainable warmth, the kind that doesn't require maintenance because it isn't performed. What I can give you is the factual outline, and trust you to understand the texture behind it. The South Waterfront parcel closed in April. Aliner's read on the zoning timeline had been correct. I updated my approach accordingly, and the acquisition came in at a better basis than my original model projected. I did not tell her she had been right, because she already knew, and because the kind of person who needs to be told they were right is not the kind of person Aliner is. By June, 2 additional acquisitions had closed. One, a distressed mixed-use property in a neighborhood I had been watching for 3 years. One, a partnership on a development project with a firm I had previously viewed as a competitor, and had come to understand, through a conversation Aliner had facilitated, was actually a more natural ally. The portfolio had grown materially. The restructuring Aliner had executed the previous autumn had produced a legal clarity that made the growth cleaner and faster than the old, commingled structure would have allowed. The empire, as I had called it, had more than doubled in value by the time December arrived. I lost a liability, but I gained an equal. That is not a cold formulation. I want to be precise about that, because the language of the preceding months has been the language of assets and documentation and controlled demolition, and I don't want the final accounting to sound like a balance sheet when what it actually describes is a life that had been operating below its capacity for a long time and had finally found its correct configuration. Aliner and I had dinner again in December. Not an anniversary observation. Neither of us is inclined toward that kind of ceremonial accounting. It was a Thursday evening, the same day of the week as the first one, which was coincidence rather than design. The same restaurant, the same table as it happened, though neither of us had requested it. The city was doing what Seattle does in December, the lights along the waterfront carrying in the low cloud cover, the bay reflecting a version of the sky that was darker and more specific than the sky itself. We ordered without consulting each other. Over the course of that dinner, Aliner told me about a case she was considering taking, a complex multi-party dispute involving a real estate development consortium, the kind of matter that would require 18 months of sustained focus and carried a level of strategic complexity that most litigators would find unmanageable. She was deciding whether the case served her practice or simply flattered it. I listened to her think through it. Not to advise, she didn't need my advice, and would have said so if she did. But because watching Aliner reason through a difficult decision was one of the more reliable pleasures of my year, and I had learned not to interfere with pleasures that were working. When she finished, she looked at me across the table. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That you already know what you're going to do," I said. She considered that, probably. "Then take the case." She looked at me for a moment with the directness that had been her consistent register from the first day I sat across from her in a difficult room. The directness that had never softened into performance, never adjusted itself to produce a more comfortable response. The directness that had been, I understood now, the thing I had been responding to from the beginning, the relief of a person who says exactly what they mean and requires the same in return. "Ask me what you actually want to ask me," she said. I had been thinking about what I wanted to ask her for several months. I had not rushed it because Aliner did not respond well to anything that felt managed, and because the right moment was not something I wanted to engineer. I had learned, across the preceding year, that certain things should be allowed to arrive rather than constructed. The moment had arrived. The best revenge is simply moving on. But I had come to understand, sitting in that restaurant in December with the city reflected in the water outside and Aliner waiting across the table with the patience of someone who already knew the answer and was giving me the space to reach it on my own terms, that moving on was not the point. The point was moving toward something that had weight and clarity and the specific gravity of two people who had seen each other at full complexity and chosen to remain in the room. I asked her. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said yes. And for the first time in longer than I could accurately account for, I didn't need to audit anything. The numbers were right. The foundation was solid. The blueprint was finally worth building.